Welcome to this edition of Peak Performers Podcast with your host, Thor Conklin. Thor will be sharing the necessary tools, strategies, and psychology you'll need to become a peak performer in any area of your life or business.
Welcome back to another episode of the Peak Performers Podcast. I'm your host, Thor Conklin, and today in studio, although she's in her studio and I'm in mine, we have Rachelle Kuramoto. Did I get it right that time?
You got it.
Excellent. You know, it only took 2 takes to get that, but we got it done. She's the founder and principal of Watchword brand. And, you know, it was interesting because I was going through and I was trying to determine how I was going to put Watchword into a box. And there is no box, but I love how you nailed it on your website. Watchword helps business articulate who they are, what they do to the people that matter the most. And I tell you, in working with businesses, I find so often that most businesses don't even know who they are. So what I'd like to do, and this is a little different format than a lot of our interviews, I want to talk about where you start with a client, because I think it's very difficult to put you in a box. If you were put yourself in a box, what would you say? Branding firm, PR firm, digital firm? I mean, it's really all encompassing.
It is, but fundamentally it's branding. Fundamentally it is a storytelling firm. But I think what makes us a little bit unusual is that we tend to do that for B2B companies more often than not. And, you know, that often starts with research. So it tends to be very, very strategic. But at the end, what it's all about is just telling the most human, the most resonant story we possibly can for these businesses, because I'm a firm believer in never, ever forgetting that no matter how big the job is or how important the people are, everybody gets up in the morning and everybody puts their pants on and everybody makes decisions with their heart and their head. And so when we think about brand, those are the things that we're thinking about.
You know, and you work with clients such as Cox, Wordplay, Fresh Market, Swift Transportation, so some major organizations where branding is so important. I think a lot of entrepreneurs with smaller businesses think, this is at least their mindset, that, you know what, I'm not big enough to be a brand yet, and I'm not really focused on my brand. And what ends up happening is they end up going off in a million different directions, and it looks like this fan, and it's getting no traction because it's just spread out. So for someone that doesn't have a brand, look, we think of these companies, we think of Apple, we think of Google, they all have a very strong brand. With a client that really hasn't found their brand yet, what's the first step that you bring them through?
You know, I think that one of the most important things to maybe dispel is that notion that small means no brand. You know, you have a brand as a person. I have a brand as a person. Small companies have a brand. It may be that it's a startup and that brand is nascent, but if you have a core purpose and you have an audience and you have something that is putting your team to work every day, even if that team is 2 people, you have the makings of, you know, of a brand. And, you know, the easiest way to think about that is brand is personality, right? And you might be small. So let's back it up to that and think about a small company as a small child. They have personality. It might be a little bit all over the place and still maturing, but there's personality there. And there's also perception. So, you know, your brand is not just who you think you are. Your brand is also who the market thinks you are. And so, you know, if you talk about a small company versus like, say, a Google or, you know, an Apple, I think that the major difference that I would highlight, honestly, is the complexity, not the importance of the brand.
You know, and in Apple's case, Apple used to be Apple Computer. They were a computer company. And they made a conscious decision that we don't want to be just a computer company. And they had to rebrand.
Yeah. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because when we do exercises with our clients and we start thinking about, you know, who their brand is, we're thinking about a few different things in particular, because we are fundamentally a content-driven firm. We're thinking about their voice, their personality, the sorts of core values on which they center their strategy and go to the market and tell their story to their audiences. And one of the really important considerations in that conversation is scale. Knowing that ideally companies are going to grow. And we really want to make sure that the brand can grow with them. Now, that is a lens that applies to a lot of different brand components as well as to the brand process as a whole. So naming, for instance, that's a really important component. And I'm glad you brought up Apple Computers because that was a name. It wasn't necessarily their brand. Their brand was bigger than that. Their name couldn't scale with that. They had to shed that, computers moniker and allow themselves the space to grow the fundamental core of that brand that they started out to be.
How often should companies be looking at their brand?
You're asking great questions. I think that I'm not so sure that I would ascribe it as a timeline as much as I would a maturity line. So, there are a few kind of inflection points at which companies are well advised to think about their brand. I think one is when you are kind of making that first step from small business or entrepreneur to small business, maybe, your audience has expanded. You have introduced a new product or service to the marketplace that sort of fundamentally extends what your company and your brand is to those who you serve. It may be that the market itself, your sector or your industry has gotten more complex or changed and it's positioned you differently. You may have some disruption in your market that forces you to rethink who your brand is so that it can compete. So it's more in line with those kinds of internal and external impacts that would kind of tell you, hey, you know what, it's time to rethink this. I think if you think about market cycles and just the general time frame for business growth, that's probably every 3 to 5 years that you would really want to do a deep dive. But it's a living, breathing thing that should always be kind of nurtured and paid attention to.
One of the things that I think is so difficult for entrepreneurs and business leaders is you build up whatever brand you have and you're putting all that energy into it. And you've got so much work put into promoting and growing that brand that you have. And now it's time you have to shift. You've got to pivot. I think it's an extremely difficult task to abandon almost what you've been doing. It's that we put all this hard work in. Now we're going to move to the left. We're going to move to the right, which is sometimes very necessary, but it's got to be just absolutely painful.
It can be. And I think, a couple things you said there are worth noting. One is the idea of abandonment. If your brand is founded on a fundamental set of core values, really immutable components of why you exist, for whom you exist, that's not going to change. Maybe the tactical details around it will change. But, the process of identifying what doesn't change actually is a really valuable way of getting right down to the brass tacks about who you are and why it matters that you exist. One of the questions we often ask in these sessions is, if you went away tomorrow, why would you be missed? What hole would you leave in the market? And sometimes that's a good way of helping companies to realize what they're not going to lose. The other thing that I would say is, we tend to approach this process with a high degree of sensitivity. When we're doing naming projects, for example, we are very cognizant of the fact that we are naming someone else's baby. We may be really good at naming, but it's not our baby. It's not our passion. And so, the process of building a brand and all of the components that go into it is very much a head and a heart kind of a process. And that is one of the reasons why it's advisable for companies to work with an objective third party, because otherwise you can get really stuck on the heart piece. You can get stuck on this is what I'm losing, and I'm not quite sure what the sort of guardrails are that I need to think about when I'm reshaping my identity. And companies can get real navel-gazy real fast if they don't have that outside objective help.
How much work do you do with their actual customers? Do you spend time interviewing them to find out? Because I think it's so interesting. We all perceive ourselves as looking or acting or doing or being, this particular thing in this marketplace. And then you talk to the customers and they're like, oh, no. They do this.
Yeah, that's really, really critical. So the way that we structure the company is we are at heart a brand content firm. But one of the arms of the company that we really have fleshed out is market intelligence. And that is because we are a firm believer in homework. We think it's really important to survey and ask questions and do interviews. And we love it when our clients say that they are willing to give the time, the space, and the resources to doing it. It doesn't have to be a monumental project, but the gut check is critical because you don't want to put in the kind of work that it takes to craft a brand only to put it into context against your competitors in a changing marketplace with audiences that may or may not be new, only to find out that it doesn't fit. Market fit's really important to brand. And so when we approach this process, at the very least, we do really robust secondary research. We look at audience, customers, competitors, market trends, not just current market trends, but emerging market trends, so that we know not only where it fits now, but where it's going to fit. We oftentimes will talk to frontline sales folks, because if you can't talk to customers and other stakeholders outside of the company, the best next people to talk to are the sales team, and ask them questions like, what's the first question you get? When someone talks to you about serving them, what do they already know about you? And is it right? Because you can glean from that a sense of how much brand equity there actually is in the marketplace, how much clarity there is in the marketplace. And those kinds of bits of information can help you build priority around not only the gaps that need to be filled with things like your messaging, but also the channels that you're going to use. So if you find out that your brand equity is really low and you're going out and introducing some new brand, well, then that awareness at that part of that awareness funnel, advertising, social media, those kinds of hey, let's just blanket the world with our presence, that's where you need to put your focus. If they've already got that, but the clarity is not there, what you need to realize is maybe putting your focus on word of mouth or some of those confirmation and validation type of messages for your brand are where the focus needs to be. So it then becomes kind of a message and medium approach, but it starts with research.
I don't know if this is me or there's a trend occurring, but I see more and more, I'll look at various websites, just random as they come up, and I look at them and I have no idea, not a clue what they do. It's like you spend all this time, all this energy, and all this money. I still have no idea what you're doing. And I'm like, all right, maybe it's because I'm not looking for what this particular company is offering. But it seemed like, I'll go back to the real old days, right, where we had yellow pages. It was categorized. You were looking for a plumber. It was under the P's. You're looking for an electrician. It was under the E's. It was very distinct and very exact of what people did because maybe they just had shorter amount of space to do it in. Now it seems like, so the question is this a trend? And do you see a lot of this ambiguity in the marketplace, and is it growing?
So I think it's a couple of things, and I'm going to make sure that I don't get lost on this, because I think ambiguity is maybe it's a missed opportunity, and I think it's a lack of strategy. So I think that oftentimes if you see a company that is trying to explain what they do and it's ambiguous, that in part they think that equates scale, right? If I'm general enough, I can kind of do whatever. I'm not going to have to put that much attention into my website and my marketing because really I can kind of pack a lot of things in there. So I think that that's one. I think two, it is to your point about the yellow pages. The yellow pages fundamentally had guidelines, right? Guardrails. And some of that was, just the insistence on brevity. But it's also category and things like that. So just going back to research for a second, if you ask yourself the few kind of guardrail questions, what do we do in a sentence? Let's try to get it down to a sentence. For whom? Better than XYZ, right? And here's why. If you can use those kind of 4 fundamental questions to build your fence and then be creative within it, what you find is you actually are crafting a positioning statement that tells people who you are, for whom, you do this better than anybody else, and why. Without those guardrails, you're just kind of talking in circles. But the other last kind of piece of it is, this ambiguity often is also a symptom of not having someone external asking you that question, asking you, we kind of like to take almost like a scientific method approach to this process where it's like you ask the question 5 times because until you ask the question 5 times, you haven't really asked the real question. If you stop with what do we do, you might just get plumbing. Great. You're a plumber. Are you a specialist plumber? Are you a commercial plumber? Are you, residential plumber? Yes. You have to get down to that lowest level of detail. And a lot of companies just don't take the time to do that.
Yeah, and I think some of the wording that they use as well, people love to use kind of the industry buzzwords or, the value added proposition for our stakeholders. What does that mean?
Nothing.
Yeah.
We like to call that cheap branding.
Right. I mean, we make stuff, that fixes pipes. Got a broken pipe? We make stuff that fixes pipes. Great. Now I know what it is.
Right. So I think one of the other things that we really challenge our clients on is the difference between commodity and differentiation. Okay. And by that, I mean commodity. You're a plumber. You do plumbing. You're welcome at the table with the other plumbers because that's where the plumbers are hanging out. All those other plumbers are wearing blue shirts. You're wearing a green one. Why is your shirt green? Why are you different? Not just different, why are you better? And I think companies tend to, in some cases, hesitate to go through that exercise because of maybe humility. Maybe because they don't know what their competitors are doing well enough to know how they stand out, or they don't really know, who their particular audience is or what they really need most. So, we really challenge our clients to take that next step from commodity to differentiation.
Yeah, I remember hearing a story recently where there was a cleaning company that did work in hospitals. Mm-hmm. And they said they're not in the business of cleaning hospitals. They're in the business of saving lives because a hospital that is well maintained and clean and germ free is an environment where people live.
Right.
And in hospitals, if it's a dirty environment with germs, people die. So they got into the psyche of the team of we're not cleaning hospitals, we're saving lives. Same thing. It's just completely different messaging.
It's actually the same thing, and it's actually, I would argue, the same messaging. It's just another level. David Ogilvy sort of introduced this concept a number of years ago, many years ago, actually, with the concept of are you selling the mattress or are you selling a good night's sleep? Same idea, right? What it does is it acknowledges a couple of things. One is that there are sort of, generally give or take 10 fundamental reasons why people buy. And some of those reasons are rational, and some of those reasons are emotional. So this is where we start to tie brand and messaging and sales all together because you are getting into that psyche of the buyer. And sometimes the psyche of the buyer is based on ROI and statistics and, social proof. Sometimes the psyche of the buyer is, I don't want my patients to die. And there's a higher level narrative. There's maybe an emotional driver. fear is a really, really good one, to your point. And, in building brand content, we really, really take the time to explore all of those reasons to buy, to categorize them as rational and emotional, and to recognize that within every audience, you may have a number of those things recognized. You may have someone who is looking to that cleaning company, and not only do they want to know that the provider is thinking about that higher level value, right? We understand that you are in the business of saving lives, and so we are your partner in that effort. But they may also want to know, yeah, well, how many have you actually kept safe? Give me the numbers behind that. So, we like to say that audiences speak many languages. And, sometimes that means, English, Spanish, Japanese, Chinese, but more often than not, it means letters and numbers.
Interesting. What about, you're doing some work for someone, and this is a personal question because this came up in our company. We finally figured out in the beginning, there was. In the beginning, we consciously, or I consciously, avoided the word coach. I didn't like it. I didn't want to be associated in that group, and you couldn't find the word coach anywhere in any content, anything that we did. Mm-hmm. Finally, all of our clients kept saying, meet our coaches, meet our coaches. So I fought it into the point where I was like, all right, I can just fight this and for spite. Even though I don't want to be lumped into that category, my clients are resonating with that word. Mm-hmm. I tell clients when it's like, I don't like that word, but that's how the clients are relating to you. Yeah.
So there's a couple of things in this.
Should I lay down on the couch or something just to get a little therapy here? Because I've struggled with this.
It's really hard. And I'll tell you what, SEO makes it even harder because, when you ask the question, what is someone going to Google to find me? And the answer is coach. You better have it in your SEO, right? You better have it in your PPC or you're going to waste a whole lot of money. Yeah. Now, when you are crafting content and you're crafting messaging that you want your stakeholders to be repeating on your behalf, creating that sort of verbal virality, if you don't want to use the word coach as a primary word, then don't. Make sure it's there somewhere, but maybe lead with that saving lives message instead of I am a message, right? What is the impact you're making as a coach? So flip the sentence around a little bit, flip it so that what you're giving people is a script to talk about the impact that you make for them and for others as a advisor, whatever word you want, and maybe go ahead and say it's advisor, and a coach. So what you're doing there is you're leading with the value and you're connecting a word that they are inclined to use to a word that you want them to use. And so that social proof piece becomes something that you are sort of influencing. It's gradual. It might be slow going, but you are sort of helping them to cultivate the right message. And then just make sure that, in anything that doesn't involve SEO, head and, lead with that value message and maybe not use the word coach. It's kind of an iterative process, but you kind of have to think about the different channels and where you put that word.
So
does that help?
It does. It does. Okay. As I was thinking about that, I was like, it's great if it's in the code somewhere, but it's on the site where you can actually read it. I just don't like it.
Yeah.
But we just decided that we could fight that. But if that's what our clients resonate with, there's a reason that they're here. Mm-hmm. Of course, when several said it, was like, all right, maybe that's a fluke. And then we just started hearing it more and more. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So once you know who they are, figuring out what they do, that seems like a kind of easy step, but something tells me what you do is actually a little bit more difficult than it sounds. Or is it?
So, what they do, I think that the complexity varies by the client, right? So our clients, for example, range from some pretty customer-friendly restaurants. Simple, right? We make pizza.
Right.
To 3-letter government agency data scientists, figuring out what these guys do and figuring out what these guys do is a whole spectrum. So we do have learning curves, and, we have questions that we ask to help companies tell us what they do. Sometimes the figuring out of what they do, the harder part is helping them to articulate it.
Yeah.
And
what are some of those questions that you ask?
So we will tell them to give us a day in the life. So give us a day in the life of a data scientist, for example. They'll start using words that, tell us the kinds of tactical things that they do. And we can take that then and ask another level of questioning to really figure out some of that sort of hierarchy of effort. So that's really one of the ways that we get to it. Another is just to have them put it on paper. We find oftentimes if someone can't necessarily articulate something well verbally, they do a really good job of writing it down, and vice versa. Just the way that, people learn audibly, kinesthetically in writing, it's the same kind of thing. So we undertake a variety of exercises until we get to the right details. And then we always read it back. Always read it back. Because they will look at it and then realize, oh, no, this technical detail's wrong, or, we missed something or whatever. So
then you have that moment where the light bulb just goes on and goes, yes, that's what we do.
That's what we do. Yes. And then, our team just does a lot of learning. We do a lot of discovery time. I personally spend a good amount of time listening to podcasts on industry topics that I'm going to write about or work in, so that I can get just a working understanding of it.
Yeah. And then also the opposite questions. A lot of times people will get stuck. I'll ask them, what do you want? They have no idea.
Yeah.
Then I say, what don't you want? Oh, let me tell you. They'll just rattle on. I don't want this. I don't want that. I don't want that. Great. So if we just take your list of what you don't want and we flipped it upside down, the opposite of all those, they're like, yeah, that's exactly what I want.
Yeah. You remember that part about the scientific method? There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Most people, I find that if you're stuck with what you want, figure out what you don't want, just flip it on its head.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk a little bit about white space. Mm-hmm. That space where nobody seems to be playing. It's either there's a reason to not playing there because it's a bad area to be playing in, or somebody's overlooked it. What do you find as you're going into the branding and figuring out their lane, if they're making some changes on how to stand out in the marketplace? How do you treat the white space, and do you find a general rule related to it? Tell us a little bit about it.
So I think one of the biggest red flags that we see is when we start working with a company and the first thing they tell us is we have no competition. There are a couple problems with that. First and foremost, if you have no competition, you're not in a market that's been proven out yet. First mover advantage can be great, but if there's no market validation, to your point, it might be because there's no market. And that becomes a real challenge, really figuring that out. Now, white space can be a great advantage, really understanding if you have a niche. And, we work a lot in technology, and I think that it can be a great kind of moment of excitement when you realize that there's a gap that's been filled here through innovation. And we now get to build a brand for, a platform that is going to innovate, even if it's just one detail of a market. It's one of the most exciting things that we do. And we've actually had a couple of projects like that in the last year. And, those often tend to be really early stage, even startups. But in cases like that, you've got a huge amount of learning to do. And that idea of doing the research to understand who the competitors might be, not are, but what is the market looking like that might bring other disruptors into the marketplace? Who are you disrupting? You might not have really thought through the companies that you're disrupting, the big guys who are going to look at what you're doing and go, oh, pipsqueak, we're going to come back at you, with more resources and squash you. That takes some foresight, and that takes research. And understanding the audiences well enough to speak to them about something new in a way that they have never really heard before, but that will connect with what they already know, so that they understand it and they're willing to give it a try. This is particularly true in technologies and finance and probably healthcare, where a lack of understanding actually can really generate fear. So what you find in that white space is reticence to adopt the brand because they're scared of what it might represent. So fundamentally, it all comes down to research. But how you apply it can either be really exciting and, full of potential, or really short-sighted and really dangerous. We try for the first.
The part that you were talking about with the competition years ago, a friend of mine that was in the cable business, he was buying up cable companies back in the 80s. When they were asked who were their competition, they said the electric company, the movie theater, the grocery store. Anything that is taking the consumer's money is a competitor.
Yep.
Because some people have to decide, are they going to buy cable or are they going to buy, extra meat for the table? Yep. And when I started thinking about competition that way, it made so much more sense. For us, we're competing for corporate dollars that they would either put into infrastructure, employees, technology, you name it. Yep. A new Bentley for the president. We end up costing about the cost of a receptionist for the year. They could buy a whole nother or get a whole nother employee. So
yeah. Well, and you bring up a really good point, and that is probably one of the most overlooked but important competitors is do nothing or do it myself.
Yeah.
And so to circle back to your point about leading with the value proposition, that's one way of overcoming that hurdle.
Yeah. Yeah. It has got to be an ROI for the investment.
Right.
Well, we could keep going on and on. It was a pleasure having you on today, because I know when we first started talking about brand, it was something I started giving a lot of thought to, and it seems very much like a process versus a destination, and it keeps expanding, it keeps evolving over time. Mm-hmm. And as we start to know more and more about ourselves, it's starting to become clear, but we know that we're just at the beginning of this road, and as we move down it, we're going to learn more, we're going to become more, and it's something that's not static. It's not one day you just say, okay, here I am, this is who we are, that's mm-hmm. it. Mm-hmm. I was just talking to some folks that design websites, and the thought process before used to be, all right, get a website, get it designed, and then once it is in place, it's like, oh, we're done, right?
Right.
But it evolves.
It evolves.
It's a living organism that needs to constantly be tweaked, changed, and updated.
Yeah.
Tell the audience how they can get in touch with you.
Well, you can always find us online, watchwordbrand.com. You're welcome to reach out to me directly, Rachelle at watchwordbrand.com. Or if it's easier, just hello at watchwordbrand.com. You don't have to spell that name. You can find us on, we're pretty active on LinkedIn. We're mostly active on LinkedIn. I really like that publishing platform. So that's probably the next easiest place to find us. But we're on the channels. We have a little bit of cobbler's children syndrome where we're managing content for so many other people that, our Facebook page and our Twitter feed are a little sad, but that's okay. We care a lot about our clients and we put a lot into them. But yeah, you can always find us on our website, and there's lots of information there. And, the one thing that I'd love to leave you with is, to your point about iteration, it is so important to think about your brand as a living thing that is going to change and iterate, which is why it is so important that you take the time to find your center point. find that lodestar so that as you change, you have that one focal point in the center that remains true, and you can build strategy on it, and you can build core values on it, and you can align your people on it and your stakeholders and talk to your marketplace. That is the thing that, is at the heart of who you are as a company. And so that exercise in just articulating that positioning, that immutable thing that is distinctly yours, is probably the most valuable thing you can do for your brand.
Love it. Great way to end that. Thank you very much for coming on today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This was super fun.
Oh, my pleasure.